Hi everybody, I'm Mike McCrory and this is Would You Make It? In this video, I'm going to make a pretty high-end travel chessboard made from ebony and boxwood, so it's pricey. And what makes this one unique is it has concealed magnets that I'm going to embed inside the ebony frame. So let's get started. I will start with the ebony and I'll begin by cutting off the end that has a waxy sealant to prevent cracking. That'll make a nice ebony doorstop. The playing field is going to be 18 inches by 18 inches, so I need to have each piece to be at least 19 inches to allow for the 1/8 inch saw blade kerf for the 8 squares. So I'm cutting this piece to be 41 inches long to give me 2 pieces that will be roughly 20 inches each. Next I'll cut the boxwood, but this piece is thick enough that I need to cut only a single piece that is 20 inches long. I likely could have cut this in a single pass, but doing multiple passes like this helps to prevent the saw blade from binding. Next, I'll joint one face and one edge of the ebony and boxwood pieces. Now it's ready to resaw. I needed one straight face and one straight edge to run the piece against the table and the fence. This board is going to be 3/4 of an inch thick when it's finished, so I'm cutting these pieces to be about 1 inch thick. This is a folding travel board, so I'm not able to use a plywood substrate because it would be visible when the board is folded. So that's why it will be solid wood all the way through. I'll plane them to be about 7/8 of an inch thick so that I have enough material left for sanding after all the glue ups. Next I'll cut strips that are 2 1/4 inches wide so that I'll end up with squares that are 2 1/4 by 2 1/4. Then I'll cut the long ebony board into 20-inch lengths. Now I'm ready for the first glue up. I'll put a strip of wood at each end of the board and clamp them vertically to try to keep the piece as flat as possible to minimize the amount of sanding that will be needed. Then I'll wipe up the excess glue so that it doesn't gum up the drum sander tomorrow. I'll let that cure overnight. The next day, I'll run it through the drum sander to clean up the glue and to get the board flat on both sides. Then, with my table saw sled, I'll square up one end. Next, I'll run it through the table saw to get 8 strips of squares. I decided to buy a brand new blade so that it'll be really sharp to help minimize any tear out when I'm cutting across the grain like this. Now it's ready for the next glue up. Since this is a folding chessboard, I'm gluing up 2 halves of the chessboard. It looks here as if I've glued everything together, but there is no glue between the D and E squares. I'm just doing this so that I can use one set of clamps for both halves. For this glue up, it's important to use a square to keep the playing field as square as possible. It won't be perfect, but the goal is to minimize the amount of trimming that will be required, because any trimming will result in the squares around the perimeter being not so square. I'm clamping a board to each end to help keep everything aligned to minimize the need for trimming. Those cauls are made from Madagascar rosewood, also known as palisander. The next day, I can run the 2 halves through the drum sander. Now it's time to work on the frame. I'll use another piece of ebony for this. It takes several passes to get that bottom edge straight. The frame is going to be 1.5 inches, but I'll make the frame pieces to be 2 inches because they will insert into the playing field with a tongue and groove fitting. I'm cutting these a little bit more than 2 inches because I'm going to resaw them in a minute and glue them back together. So I need a little extra material because they'll need to be trimmed after the glue up. The frame is going to have concealed magnets to help keep the 2 halves together when the board is folded. To conceal the magnets, I'm resawing the frame piece so that I can insert the magnets from the inside, and then I'll glue the 2 pieces back together again. I've marked the edges of each piece so that I can glue them back together correctly. I want the magnets to be as close as possible to the surface, and I want to have enough wood on the other side to inlay algebraic notation. So I'm not cutting these down the middle. The piece with the magnet will be thinner, and the piece with the inlaid notation will be thicker. Now I'll sand off the blade marks from the bandsaw so that I have a flat surface for the glue. Next, at the CNC, I'm going to cut the pockets for the magnets. I've put some markings on each piece to make sure that I'm cutting on the correct side of the board, And I've put a dot at the end of the board to serve as a reference and to signify where this piece will touch the adjoining piece. This is important to ensure the magnets line up when the board is folded, so they need to be the same distance from that reference point. For the longer frame pieces, I'll put a single pocket in the center. The reason I'm using a CNC for this instead of a Forstner bit is because these magnets are going to be very close to the surface. A Forstner bit has a center point that would protrude through the surface, so that would not work for this situation. I'm going to insert 2 magnets into each pocket to get a strong enough attraction. These magnets have a diameter of 20 millimeters, which is slightly more than 3/4 of an inch. I'm being really careful to insert them in the right way so that the 2 sides will attract rather than repel each other. A quick test to make sure they're oriented correctly before I add the glue. I'm using a bit of Starbond medium thickness CA glue to secure them so that they do not rattle around. Now I'll glue the other half back onto each piece, making sure that I glue the correct pieces together. Then I'll clamp them tightly to minimize any glue line. I'm actually not too concerned about a glue line because it will be hidden with boxwood edge banding that I'll add around the perimeter. But it could be visible at the end of each half if I'm not careful. I'll test the attraction before clamping because this is my last chance to fix it if I got it wrong. For the longer pieces, I ran out of 20mm magnets because I hadn't planned to double them up, so I added 4 1/4" magnets for the second layer. It won't be quite as strong, but it'll still provide enough holding power. You can see the glue line before jointing, so I'll remove that. It's kind of cool how the piece sticks to the fence. Next, I'll cut the frame pieces to be 2 inches wide. For the ends of the frame pieces that are going to be mating, I'm going to cut them together after lining up the magnets. I'll do the same for the long pieces by lining up the magnets and then cutting one end to be my reference point. I'll cut the first miter directly at that end, and then the miter at the other end can be cut inward from the other end to get the right length. Now I'm just going to mark the cuts because it would be easy to make a mistake and end up with improper alignment of the magnets. And I already made one mistake with my marking, but luckily I noticed. And then I labeled the pieces to try to keep them in the correct order so that the grain is more or less continuous. It's not super important for ebony because the grain pattern is so subtle, but it's still a good practice. Then I'm marking where the brass inlay will go and where the edge banding will go. I'm doing my best to minimize any errors. Next, I'll prepare a strip of wood that I can use for the edge banding. I hate to cut such a large piece of boxwood, but I'll use the leftover part of the strip to cut the algebraic notation, so I'll have almost no waste at all. The first thing I'll do is use my dado set to cut a groove in the outer edge for the edge banding. That piece of boxwood that I just cut will fit into these grooves. I'll make the first cut, and then I'll flip the board end to end and make a second cut to ensure that the groove is centered. Now I'll cut the boxwood to be slightly larger than the groove, and then I'll sand it to the precise thickness so that it fits tightly into the groove. Now I'll glue those pieces in and let it cure overnight. So while the glue is drying, I want to announce the winner from the giveaway from my last video, and it's a Top Tez moisture meter. So what I did is I downloaded all the comments into Microsoft Excel. I sorted the comments by username alphabetically, and then I used a random number generator to select the row number of the winning commenter, and that is Heathen Hammer. So congratulations. I'll leave a reply in your comment with instructions, but really what I'd like you to do is send me an email with that username as the email sender. Give me your contact information and I'll ship this off to you. Congrats! Before cutting the groove into the edges of the playing field for the tongue and groove fitting, I need to trim the edges and take off the tiniest amount possible to eliminate any unevenness that was introduced during the last glue up. It's impossible to avoid a bit of trimming, but this one is lined up pretty well, so I don't have to remove much at all. Now I'll trim off the excess edge bending. Before cutting the groove around the perimeter of the playing field, I've marked the two mating edges with blue tape because I want to be sure that I don't cut a groove there. It's way too easy to make a mistake like that, so I need a visual reminder. I'll add this jig over my fence to keep the chessboard vertical when I'm cutting the groove. Then I'll clamp the board to the jig to prevent it from wandering, and then I'll push it through the dado stack. Similar to the edge banding, I'm cutting twice by flipping the board around to ensure the groove is perfectly centered. I'm using the thickness of the board where the groove is to help set the starting point for the height of the dado blade, and then I'll sneak up on the fit. I want the frame to be 1.5 inches wide, so I'm setting the fence to be 1.5 inches away from the inside edge of the blade. I'll use a feather board to help keep the frame pieces tight to the frame. I also have my push block angled slightly toward the fence to keep it tight. I had to adjust the dado stack's height several times until the tongue fit into the groove around the playing field. Next, I'm changing to a ripping blade because it has a flat top grind. I'm going to cut a rabbet along the inner edge of the frame to hold a 1/8 inch strip of brass. I'm using the piece of brass to set the blade height. I'm setting the blade height a little higher so that the brass strip will be slightly recessed because these frame pieces are still a little thicker than the playing field, so they'll need to be sanded. I'm doing that so that I don't need to sand the brass too much. Now I'm eyeballing the position of the fence so that I take off exactly 1/8 of an inch of material so that the brass will fit tightly against the playing field when it's glued up. I'll sand the brass with 320 grit sandpaper to remove any oxidation and roughen the surface so that the CA glue will adhere better. I'm using Starbond thick CA glue, and then I'll spray two sides of the brass with the accelerator so that it sticks immediately. It gives me a couple of seconds to make an adjustment, but that's all I need. I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like there's a certain creepiness to those black gloves. Now I'll run the pieces through the drum sander. The main reason I don't want to sand the brass too much is because the brass gets very hot while sanding, and the heat will release the CA glue. So I'm taking light passes, and I'm sanding one piece, setting it aside while I sand the next piece, and then I come back to it again after it's had a chance to cool. I have to trim the short frame pieces one more time to trim off the excess brass and boxwood edge bending. Because the ebony is so dark, I'm adding a piece of tape on each piece where I need to make a miter cut so that I can see the pencil marks that I'll make before cutting. I also want to be absolutely sure that I'm cutting the right end. The short pieces need to be 10.5 inches long, and the long frame pieces need to be 21 inches long. You can see that bandage and a bit of blood oozing out, and that's because when I was setting things up on my CNC, the CNC was turned off, but I reached across to grab something and I snagged my hand on the 15-degree CNC router bit, and it sliced my hand open like a scalpel. I was surprised how sharp it was. I probably should have gotten stitches, but I didn't want to waste time. Everything fits well, so it's ready to glue up. I'll clamp it to tighten up the miter joints and then wipe off the excess glue to make the sanding easier. The next day, I sanded everything flat. Now it's time to carve the male portions of the algebraic notation inlay. I'm using the leftover piece of boxwood, but I want it to be more rigid because I have very little room for clamps. So I'm taping it to a piece of poplar that I can clamp onto. I'll use the blue tape and CA glue trick to make double-sided tape. And now I'll let the CNC do its thing. I'm starting with a 30-degree V-bit, and then I'll finish up with a 1/8 inch end mill to clear out all of the rest of the wood. I'll use the bandsaw to cut out each of the letters. Next, I'll cut the female portions of the notation for the inlay into the frame. Somehow, the notation got magically glued into the frame. I remember recording it, but somehow I lost the footage. But it's a fairly straightforward process to glue them in place and then clamp them so that they're stuck into the frame as deeply as possible. The first pass was a little dangerous at the end, so I did it a little differently for the second piece. This time I cut almost to the end, and then I flipped the board around so that my hands were not so close to the blade. It's always rewarding when you sand and reveal the notation and see that it all fit perfectly. On the other side, the client wants his initials in the lower right corner, but there's a magnet very close to that corner, so I had to be careful not to cut into it. I put a magnet on the outside to locate the magnet that was under the surface. The magnet under the surface is 20 millimeters versus this one that's 12 millimeters, so I don't have as much room as it appears. I had just enough room to carve the initials without hitting the magnet that's just below the surface. The client wanted gold leaf for his initials. This is not the easiest font for gold leaf because it's so narrow, but I gave it my best shot. My backup plan was going to be to fill it with gold epoxy if this didn't work. I'm starting with a yellow sealer. Some people use a red sealer for gold leaf, but yellow works too. I let that dry for about an hour, and then I applied the sizing, which took another 30 minutes to dry. You know that it's ready to apply the gold leaf when the sizing changes from milky white to clear. Since the font is so narrow and deep, I had to keep folding the gold leaf over and forcing it into the space, but it seemed to work. I let that dry for a while and then I sanded off the excess. It turned out not too bad. The last thing to do is to insert magnets into the mating edges of the two halves. I'm using 12 millimeter magnets for the edge, which are a little less than ½ inch in diameter, so I'm using a 12 millimeter Forstner bit. I have the drill press set to stop at the exact depth that I need so that the magnets are flush with the edge. I had to be sure that I didn't mess up the polarity of the magnets, so I put a black dot on the two outer sides, and then I placed the black dot down into the hole. I used Starbond medium thickness CA glue for the magnets. I'm glad I marked the magnets with the dot because the first pair attracted to each other and they jumped out. To prevent that, I slid one side to the right so that the magnets would not be directly beside each other. After the magnets were inserted and pushed down tightly, I sprayed them with accelerant so that the accelerant would seep down the sides and hold everything in place. I thought I would only need 3 magnets on each half, but they were not powerful enough, so I ended up adding 2 more afterward. Another possibility would have been to double up the magnets like I did in the frame pieces. Next, I rounded over the perimeter of the board using a 16th inch roundover bit. I went in the correct direction for the first pass and then came back with a climb cut to clean everything up because it's a little difficult to keep the base of this router horizontal. And then I did some final hand sanding with 220 grit sandpaper to prepare for the finish. Sometimes I apply a coat of shellac to the boards that I make, but I didn't think it was appropriate to add a yellowish tone to this black and white board, so I'm going straight to a lacquer finish. I'm using a pre-catalyzed lacquer, which is nice to work with because it dries quickly and is very forgiving. There are so many insects at this time of year that I kept having to sand them out between coats. I sanded with 320 grit sandpaper between each coat, and I got lucky with the final coat because all of the insects had gone to bed for the night. I let the lacquer cure for several days. I used a satin finish and it looks really nice, but I suspect it's a little too shiny for the client, so I'm going to dull it down to a matte finish using a Mirka Merlon 1500 grit scuff pad. So I gotta ask, would you make it?